caught the look in his eyes the moment he thought no one was watching. Just a flicker, quick, calculating, gone before anyone else could notice. But I noticed. And that one moment changed everything. My name is Margaret, and I am 63 years old. I live on a property outside Kelowna, British Columbia, that my late husband and I built together over 31 years of marriage. Not built in the romantic, metaphorical sense. I mean, we physically cleared the land, poured money into the orchard, negotiated with contractors, fought with the municipality over permits, and stayed up past midnight more times than I can count going over spreadsheets at the kitchen table. When Gordon passed away 4 years ago from a cardiac event that gave us no warning and no time to say a proper goodbye, he left me with 42 acres, a working fruit orchard, a modest investment portfolio worth just under $2 million, and a grief so heavy I didn't know how I would carry it. But I carried it, because that is what you do. My son Daniel was 34 when his father died. He took it hard in that quiet way men sometimes do. He didn't cry at the funeral, but I found him sitting alone in his father's workshop 3 weeks later, holding a wrench Gordon used to keep on the pegboard above the workbench. Daniel is a good man. Careful, loyal, the kind of person who remembers your birthday not because he put it in his phone, but because he genuinely remembers. He works as a structural engineer for a firm in Vancouver and drives up to Kelowna every 6 or 7 weeks to check on me and the property. He worries about me being out here alone with the 2 hired hands and the seasonal pickers. I tell him I am fine. Mostly I am. About 18 months after Gordon passed, Daniel started seeing someone. Her name was Vivienne, and she worked in financial consulting in downtown Vancouver. He brought her to the property for the first time on a long weekend in May, and I made the kind of meal Gordon always loved: baked salmon, roasted vegetables from the garden, a blueberry crumble with the berries we'd frozen from the previous harvest. I wanted her to feel welcome. I wanted to like her, for Daniel's sake. And I did like her. At first, she was polished and articulate and made good eye contact. She laughed at the right moments and helped clear the table without being asked. But it was over coffee on the back porch that evening, watching the sun drop behind the hills across the valley, that I noticed the first thing. She asked me how many acres the property was. I told her 42. She nodded slowly, looking out over the orchard, and said, "And all of that is yours outright? No mortgage or anything on it?" I said yes. Gordon and I had paid it off entirely 12 years before he died. She nodded again, said nothing more. At the time, I thought it was just small talk, the kind of questions people ask when they're sitting on someone's land and trying to make conversation. I filed it away and didn't think about it again that night. But she asked again in August, when Daniel brought her back for a second visit. This time she asked how far the property extended to the east, toward the neighboring orchard. I told her the creek marked the eastern boundary. She asked who owned the land on the other side. I said a family named Peterson had owned it for decades, but their adult children had been trying to sell it off since their parents moved to a care home. She asked what the land was currently assessed at. I remember pausing before I answered. Not because I didn't know I knew the assessment figures very well, but because something in the way she asked it felt like a question with a purpose behind it, like she already knew the answer and was testing whether mine would match. I gave her a vague answer about rural assessments being unpredictable and changed the subject. By the third visit, in October, I was paying attention in a different way. I watched how she moved through the house. I noticed that she spent a long time in Gordon's study, longer than any guest would naturally linger, and when I passed by the doorway, I saw her looking at the framed certificates on the wall. Gordon had kept his business registrations there, some old partnership agreements from the early years of the orchard, that kind of thing. Nothing of immediate financial value, but the kind of paperwork that tells a careful observer how an estate is structured. I said nothing. But I started keeping notes in a small book I kept in my bedside drawer. What I wrote in those first months seemed small in isolation. A question about the orchard's annual yield. A comment she made about how rural properties in the Okanagan had appreciated enormously and that it was smart to think about estate planning sooner rather than later. A moment at dinner in November when she mentioned, almost offhandedly, that she had a colleague who specialized in agricultural asset transfers and had helped several families simplify their estate structures before probate became complicated. I am not a naive woman. I raised a son, ran a business, managed farm payroll, and negotiated supply contracts with distributors who thought a widow wouldn't push back. I know what unsolicited estate planning advice from a near stranger sounds like. It sounds like someone who has already been thinking about your assets for longer than they should have been. I called my lawyer in December. Her name is Patricia, and she has handled our family's legal matters since before Daniel was born. I told her I wanted to review my will, update my power of attorney documents, and move several key original documents, including the land title, my investment account agreements, and Gordon's original business registration papers to her office safe. Patricia asked if something had happened. I told her I wasn't sure yet, but that I wanted everything locked down before I was sure. She said, "Margaret, you've always had good instincts. Let's do it." In January, Daniel told me he and Vivienne were engaged. I said all the right things. I hugged my son. I asked to see the ring. I made tea and we sat at the kitchen table and I listened to him talk about her with the kind of warmth in his voice that told me he was fully, genuinely in love with her. That made what I suspected harder to sit with, because my concern was not that she didn't care about my son at all, it was that she cared about more than just him. The engagement changed the frequency of her questions. Suddenly she was at the property more often, sometimes driving up from Vancouver without Daniel, framing the visits as wanting to spend time with me, get to know me better, build a relationship before the wedding. I appreciated the gesture on the surface, but each visit contained at least one question about the property, the investments, or my plans for the estate. She asked once whether I had considered putting the orchard into a family trust. She asked another time whether Daniel was listed as a joint account holder on my investment accounts. When I said no, she tilted her head and said that was unusual for families with significant assets, that most financial advisors would recommend it for continuity purposes. I asked her which financial advisor had told her that. She smiled and said she had just picked things up over the years in her line of work. That evening, after she left, I added 4 more entries to my notebook. In March, something happened that moved my quiet concern into a different category entirely. I had a routine appointment with my GP, Dr. Abioye, at his clinic in Kelowna. It was a standard checkup, nothing unusual. But when I arrived at the reception desk, the receptionist told me that someone had called the clinic 2 days prior, asking about my file specifically, asking whether I had been assessed recently for cognitive decline. The receptionist said she had not disclosed anything, of course, because no one outside the office is entitled to that information, but she thought I should know someone had called. I asked if the caller had left a name. She hesitated, then said the person had identified herself as a family member helping to coordinate my care. I have no siblings. My parents are long gone. Daniel is my only immediate family, and I knew for certain he had not made that call. He would have told me. He would never go around me to my doctor. That is not who my son is. I sat in my car in the clinic parking lot for a long time after that appointment. The orchard, the investments, the land title locked safely at Patricia's office. Someone was building a case that I was losing my mental capacity. That is a specific legal strategy. If you can establish that a person is cognitively impaired, you can challenge the validity of documents they've signed, argue that they can't manage their own affairs, and potentially seek guardianship or power of attorney through the courts. In British Columbia, the process is called representation agreements and committeeship under the Patients Property Act. I had read about elder financial abuse cases before they appear in the news more often than people realize, but I had never imagined I would be on the receiving end of one. I called Patricia that afternoon and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said quietly, "Margaret, this is not small. I want you to keep documenting everything, and I want to refer you to someone." The someone she referred me to was a private investigator named Brenda, based in Kelowna, who specialized in financial fraud and elder exploitation cases. Within 3 weeks, Brenda had found that Vivienne had done this before. Not identically, but the pattern was recognizable. 7 years earlier, she had been in a relationship with a widower in Calgary who owned commercial property. The relationship ended before any legal action was taken, but the man's adult daughter had filed a complaint with a provincial regulatory body about Vivienne's conduct in connection with an attempted transfer of assets. The complaint had been reviewed but not escalated, and Vivienne had moved provinces shortly afterward. She was not a criminal in the legal sense yet, but she was practiced. I spent 2 weeks deciding what to do with what I knew. I thought about calling Daniel directly, sitting him down and telling him everything, but I knew my son. He was in love. He would want evidence he could see and touch, not a file from a PI and his mother's instincts. He might believe me, but the doubt would poison something between us if I was wrong. And even if I was right, confronting Vivienne privately might cause her to simply pivot her approach or disappear and leave Daniel heartbroken without ever understanding why. I needed him to see it himself. The engagement party was scheduled for the last Saturday in April at a private event space in downtown Kelowna. Vivienne's family was flying in from Ontario. Friends, colleagues, people from the firm where Daniel worked. 64 people on the guest list. I told Patricia and Brenda my plan. Patricia thought I was taking a significant risk. Brenda said she had seen this approach work before, and she could have documentation ready in a format that would be clear to anyone in that room. I also told Daniel not everything, but enough. I asked him to trust me. I told him I needed him to do one thing at the party without asking me why until afterward. I told him I loved him more than anything in the world and that everything I was doing was to protect him. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Okay, Mum." The night before the engagement party, I barely slept. I lay in the dark in the house Gordon and I had built, and I thought about all the ways things could go wrong. I thought about my son's face. I thought about the look in Vivienne's eyes that October evening in Gordon's study. I got up at 5:30 and made coffee and walked out to the orchard in the early light, and I stood among the trees Gordon had planted in the first years of our marriage, and I felt, more than anything else, certain. The engagement party began at 7 in the evening. I arrived early and spoke with the venue manager, a quiet man named Paul who had helped with logistics for several Kelowna charity events I'd been involved with over the years. I told him I might need to address the room at some point and asked if he could have a microphone available. He said, "Of course." For the first hour and a half, I was simply a mother at her son's engagement party. I made conversation. I met Vivienne's parents, who were warm and seemed genuinely fond of Daniel. I felt a pang of sadness for them, knowing what was coming. I accepted a glass of white wine and barely touched it. I watched Vivienne across the room, watched her laugh and accept congratulations, watched her put her hand on Daniel's arm, and I noticed she looked relaxed in a way she never quite looked when it was just the three of us at the property. Here, surrounded by people, she was performing ease. At the orchard, she had been performing warmth. At 8:45, Daniel caught my eye from across the room. I nodded. He leaned down and said something quietly to Vivienne. I watched her expression shift just slightly, a small tightening around the eyes as he handed her a folded piece of paper. He told her, as we had planned, that it was a message from me and that I'd asked her to read it privately before coming to find me. The paper said, "I know about Calgary, I know about the clinic call, and I have everything documented. Come find me when you're ready to talk." I had positioned myself near the edge of the room, close to where Paul had set up the small podium with the microphone. Brenda was seated at a table near the back, her briefcase beside her chair. When Vivienne crossed the room toward me, she was moving with a particular kind of controlled speed, not running, but close. Her face was composed, but her eyes were doing something different. She stopped in front of me and said very quietly, "What is this?" I said, "I think you know what it is." She said, "You're making a mistake. You're going to embarrass Daniel in front of everyone." I said, "I'm going to protect my son in front of everyone. There's a difference." She started to speak again, and I reached over and took the microphone from the podium. The room quieted faster than I expected. 64 people. The kind of quiet that happens when someone older picks up a microphone at a party and the room collectively understands something unscripted is about to happen. I said, "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight to celebrate Daniel. He is the best thing I have ever done in my life, and his happiness matters more to me than my own comfort. Which is why I have to share some things I've learned over the past several months, because I believe the people in this room who love my son deserve to hear them." I kept it to 7 minutes. Patricia had helped me structure it factual, documented, no Abioye's clinic, with the receptionist present and willing to provide a statement. The regulatory complaint from Calgary, which Brenda now held up as a printed document and passed to the nearest table so it could circulate. The timeline of questions about the property and the investments, which I read from my notebook, the small book I had kept since October, with dates and direct quotations. I said, I am not a lawyer. I am a 63-year-old woman who grew up in this valley and worked this land with my husband for 31 years. I know what someone looks like when they are interested in what I own. And I know what it means when someone calls your doctor asking about your cognitive state. The room was very still. Vivian left without speaking. Her parents remained, and her mother was crying quietly into a cloth napkin. I felt deeply sorry for them. Daniel stood beside me after I put the microphone down. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he put his arm around my shoulders and leaned his head against mine, and I felt him exhale a long, slow breath, like something he'd been holding for longer than either of us had known. He said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough." He asked if I had been scared to do it here, in front of everyone. I said yes. I had been scared every day since October. But I had also learned, in 31 years of marriage and 4 years of widowhood and 63 years of living, that the things worth protecting are always worth the fear. Vivian retained a lawyer briefly but withdrew when Patricia made clear the scope of documentation we held. We never went to court. She moved back to Ontario within 2 months. Daniel took some time. He was hurt in the way you are hurt when you realize that something you believed was real was at least partly constructed. He went quiet for a while, and I gave him space and called him every Sunday and didn't push. By midsummer, he was driving up to Kelowna again on his regular schedule, and one evening we sat on the back porch with coffee. The same porch where Vivienne had asked about the acreage on her first visit, and he said he had been going over everything in his memory, looking for the moments he'd missed. I told him that people like Vivian are skilled at being easy to miss. That is the entire skill. He nodded and looked out over the orchard, and after a while he asked me how Gordon used to know when to trust someone. I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, he used to say that the people worth trusting are the ones who never make you feel like you owe them something for their kindness. Daniel was quiet for a long time after that. The orchard had a good season that year. We brought in more than expected from the cherry harvest, and the ambrosia apples came in clean and well-sized, which made the packing house happy. I walked the rows in the early mornings the way Gordon used to, checking the trees the way he taught me, and I thought about what it means to tend something over decades, to plant in faith and show up every season regardless of what the weather does. The land title is still at Patricia's office, along with all the other important documents. I go in every year to review my will and keep everything current, because I have learned that clarity about what you own and who you trust is not paranoia. It is the most loving thing you can do for the people you will one day leave behind. I am 63 years old. I have 42 acres and a working orchard and a son who drives up from Vancouver every 6 or 7 weeks to have coffee on the back porch and talk about his father. I have a small notebook in my bedside drawer that I hope I never need to write in again. And I have learned more clearly than I ever expected to that protecting what your family built together is not a betrayal of love. It is the fullest expression of it.